Good evening and welcome. I hope you've had the opportunity to virtually attend some of the many wonderful events offered so far by Map to the Door of No Return at 20, a gathering. You are certainly in for a treat with this one. We will begin with marking the violent histories of where we are, with making note of reminding us of the ongoing conflicts and contradictions of this land, this water, this air. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of Haudenosaunee. The meeting place of Toronto remains the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us. Those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who have come here by force, or otherwise as a result of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism and ongoing wars. When we enter any room, even or especially virtual rooms like these, we must bring these histories into view. This acknowledgement is particular to Toronto, the location of York University, and the host of a Map of the Door of No Return at 20, a gathering. But we are meeting together virtually from countries around the world with their own histories of conquest, white settler colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and ongoing wars. And we must also acknowledge and bring those histories and present into view. It is with this knowledge we enter and meet here in the hopes of making a different world. My name is Dr. Danielle Howard. I am currently the Assistant Professor of Theater History, and Dramaturgy at York University. And I am delighted to welcome you to a staged reading of MAP, followed by a Q&A. I will now introduce Dr. Jaye Austin Williams, the director and adapter of the excerpt you are about to witness. She will offer opening remarks shortly after. Jaye Austin Williams is currently C. Graydon and Mary E. Rogers Faculty Fellow and Assistant Professor of Critical Black Studies at Bucknell University. She brings a professional theater career of nearly 30 years, during which she worked on and off Broadway and regionally, into her current academic pursuits, in which she focuses on the theorization of Black drama and cinema at the intersection of critical Black studies, Black feminism, performance studies, and theater. She holds a PhD from the Joint Doctoral Program in Theater and Drama at UC Irvine and UC San Diego, and an MFA in Dramatic Writing from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Her recent publications include Alienated Flesh at the Place of Trauma and Death, Unearthing the Black Queered Inhuman in Susan Laurie Park's one-character short play, Pickling, which is in the Palgrave Handbook of Queer and Trans Feminisms in Performance. The Always Already of Anti-Blackness, an interview by Sarah Moraes dos Santos Bruce, which is in the Minor on the Move Doing Cosmopolitanisms, and On the Trappings of Censorship, Discourse, and Civil Circumvention of Rupture, found in The Dynamics of Circulation, Suppression, and Censorship. She is currently completing a monograph entitled Staging Within Violence Toward Radical Black Dramaturgy. Please join me in welcoming Jaye Austin Williams.
Thank you so very much. For that warm welcome and wonderful introduction. It is an honor beyond words to have the opportunity to begin the process of adapting such a landmark text for the stage. A Map to the Door of No Return dares to take up the Middle Passage and beyond by way of confronting its inextricability from our existences and passages in the present, through liminal, generational, geographical, speculative, and certainly polyvalenced antagonistic spaces. Since my very first opportunity to adapt a profound Black feminist text for the stage, poet and author Sapphire's book, American Dreams, which I adapted and directed at the Sundance Theater Lab back in 1997, and later at the Public Theater in New York, I've been moved to pursue this practice of setting the contemplative, poetic analytics of Black women in space, not because they need or require further dimension, but because those analytics deserve to reach different constellations of audience assemblage, and vice versa. And because these works' embodiment in imaginative space allows us an opportunity to sit with their palpable stakes, piqued by a different sensory transmission of them. I'm indebted to Dr. Christina Sharp for being alive to my expressed wish to adapt this astounding work, and certainly to Dionne Brand for having the extraordinary mind that birthed it. What we will share with you today is but a snippet, a pebble skip across a meditation that is vast, and the balance of which I look forward to adapting in earnest in the not too distant future. So with that, we will begin to give you a reading with my fellow readers and collaborators, Amber Starr Friendly and Evan Michael Lee, A Map to the Door of No Return, Notes to Belonging by Dionne Brand, and an excerpt from that adaptation for the stage by yours truly. A Map to the Door of No Return. Prologue. Out of the blackness emanate the vast harmonics that were relegated to the ocean's void. We hear the narrator's voice, and across a scrim, we see the following projected.
There are maps to the door of no return, the physical door. They're well worn, gone over by cartographer after cartographer, refined from Ptolemy's Geographia to orbital photographs and magnetic field imaging satellites.
From various unlocatable distances are myriad sounds of the Black diaspora. Lights begin to splay and search alternately, as though both painting and straining to find runways toward destinations, as the narrator's voice appears once again.
But to the door of no return, which is illuminated in the consciousness of Blacks in the diaspora, there are no maps. This door is not mere physicality. It is a spiritual location. It is also perhaps a psychic destination. Since leaving was never voluntary, return was and still may be an intention, however deeply buried. There is, as it says, no way in, no return.
As the narrator speaks this last, the lights, wild with searching, give way to both shimmering mute, stunned blackness and an array of old maps, animate if possible, all around the stage, charting the spaces from Europe, cutting swaths through the continent of Africa, and from West Africa over to the Caribbean and to the Americas. A title appears, A Circumstantial Account of a State of Things. Downward spotlights illuminate two spaces on opposite sides of the stage. The narrator sits at a desk, typing at her computer, remembering. Opposite and slightly upstage, we see a tableau of the narrator as a little girl, standing, looking up at her grandfather, tugging at his pant leg. He looks down at her, searching her face. The narrator speaks in remembrance, giving future voice to this moment in her young past.
My grandfather said he knew what people we came from. I reeled off all the names I knew. Yoruba?
No.
Igbo?
Mm-mm.
Ashanti?
Nope.
Mendigo? I pestered him for days.
I would know if I heard it. Now, stop bothering me.
I studied him intently when he came home. I searched the gray bristles of his mustache for any flicker which might suggest he was about to speak.
Shoo now. Go on and find some book to read or work to do.
At times it seemed as if Papa was on the brink of remembering. I imagined pulling the word off his tongue. If only I knew the first syllable. Papa never remembered. Having no name to call on was having no past. Having no past pointed to the fissure between the past and the present.
Sweet Honey in the Rock's harmonies intone echo, nothing but an echo of the past.
I carried the space with me. Over time, it has changed shape and light as the question it evokes has changed in appearance and angle. The name of the people we came from has ceased to matter.
The voices of what Saidiya Hartman calls the lost archive ghost forth. On a scrim appear reflections of their ghostliness glistening atop the ocean water. Then we see the following as the archive, the ensemble of actors, speaks it.
Maps. The rufous hummingbird travels 5,000 miles from summer home to winter home and back. It is a bird whose origins and paths are the blood of its small body, whose desire to find its way depends on drops of nectar from flowers.
The ensemble's voices whisper and overlap as we see an image ripple across the scrim.
Water.
Water is the first thing in my imagination. Over the reaches of the eyes at Gaia when I was a little girl, I knew that there was still more water. All beginning in water, all ending in water. The sea behind the house where I was born was a rough country sea.
It echoes and crashes in her memory. As the narrator reads the following, the ensemble appears scattered around the stage and the theater in beautiful, complicated, straining toward the embodiment of diaspora, grappling with the discard that is so routinely over-determined onto them.
To the south, on a clear day, you could see the mainland of South America. To the north was the hinterland of Trinidad. To the west was the bird's beak of Venezuela, and to the east, the immense Atlantic gaping to Africa. People here believe in
uncontrollable passion,
mad rages,
and in the brusque inevitability of death, or damage, as if
a face would not be a face without a scar, finger not a finger without being broken,
or a foot not a foot without a limp, or a life
not a life without tragedy.
These things I knew before I knew they had something to do with the door of no return and the sea. I knew that everyone here was unhappy and haunted in some way.
On a scrim appears in a blue while.
At 8 a.m, the radio in the living room crackles over the gulls and roosters. In the middle is the ovular sound of the BBC. It is
the news from away.
Once in a while an island is mentioned, once in a blue while. You hear you are living
elsewhere.
The BBC announcer is calling you,
telling you the news.
Elsewhere is not a bad place at all. It is simply
elsewhere.
You have seen on the borders of maps of islands.
Natives, nubile and fierce.
You are living on an island.
Banished or uninhabited.
Or so it seems through the voice of the BBC. You are therefore already mythic. My city was a city in my imagination where someone suddenly and plainly appears as if belonging and not belonging, where someone may disappear also into nothing and everything. I stepped into the cool opening of the door of no return. My feet landed where my thoughts were. This is the trick of the door, to step through and be where you want to be. Our ancestors were bewildered because they had a sense of origin, some country, some village, some family where they belonged and from which they were rent. We, on the other hand, have no such immediate sense of belonging, only of drift.
The narrator joins her uncle in a time long ago.
According to my uncle, the world was
its books, its worlds, its language, its words, its language.
His evenings of grammar drills induced illnesses, panic attacks, nausea, and sleepiness.
It could never have.
He would shout to some child saying, "Uncle, it have a man outside asking for you."
There are, for the plural, but it could never have.
Soon there was pure silence around my uncle.
What is the Spanish word for butter?
Mantequilla?
For bread?
Pan.
For butterfly?
Mariposa.
Girl?
Niña.
Water?
Agua.
Beach?
Playa.
And for dreams?
Sueños.
Hope?
Esperanza?
Lights fade on her uncle. The narrator walks back into the present. On a scrim appears conjugations in disgrace and paradise.
Well, I suppose then, my uncle taught me to hang on to the world from the arms of books, or words at any rate, to be alert to translation even as your feet dance.
The sound of a jet flying by overhead. The narrator crosses and sits in an airplane seat. She pulls 2 books out of her bag and considers them. The projected images of J.M. Coetzee and Toni Morrison appear on opposite sides of the stage. Alternate soundtracks and images of them speaking meld and then collide.
So I am on a plane going to Australia, reading J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace. It is his only novel where one can clearly read race as its subject. To enter Coetzee's earlier work was to enter that odd trope, the universal, the human. At least some of us could. Others of us who saw a less noble and more vulgar world may have been untouched, or may have, being more cynical, read the trope as white. I longed for inclusion in his human, as I had yearned for decades before to dance with my uncle, but had dreaded his jolting conjugations.
A crescendo of chaos envelops the theater as, on another part of the stage and around the theater space, in cacophonous sense around, the ensemble become people screaming in terror, being chased by the police.
For me, Coetzee's narratives, for all their universality, could not contest or enlighten the other narratives emanating from South Africa. I mean the crowds of demonstrators being shot by deadly bullets or whipped with sjambuks, the desert-like hunger of townships, the imprisonments, the detainees being thrown from multi-storied police buildings, the physical tortures, the political prisoners whose bodies were braced in the elegant language of resistance.
The chaos fades.
Perhaps the universal could not compete or respond to this din of narrations. On the plane to Australia, traversing Coetzee, South Africa, Toni Morrison's Paradise limbs on the horizon. These two, Disgrace and Paradise, seem to be in conversation with each other.
Playing across the scrim, or various scrims, is a vivid montage from the 1960s and 1970s of iconic figures, many non-Black, marching, speaking and singing in passionate support of women's rights, gay rights, and of course, civil rights.
To enter Toni Morrison's fiction is to enter her rewriting of the myth of America. And so it is also a conversation about grace, redemption, and that quintessential American ideal, happiness.
Sound and images fade.
In a society so invested in its inherent goodness and moral superiority, Morrison's voice is always trenchant. Within all that grand beauty is a palpable disillusion and inexorable tragedy. The big question here is, up in the sky where the big questions can be pondered. Is Coetzee saying that for white South Africans, there is no meaningful or moral survival without apartheid? Or is he saying that apartheid is as much social system as physical body? Is he saying that whites are irredeemable?
The lulling sound of external turbines.
I am about to fall into one of those disturbed sleeps one falls into on planes. Now it is amplified by Coetzee's dread. In the gaps of waking and sleeping, I plummet into the middle of paradise. There is an exquisite chapter called Divine. It opens at a wedding with a sermon on love, which we are drawn into like being drawn stunningly into hell, well, into clarity.
The play's ensemble are gathered on another part of the stage and scattered throughout the performance space, attending a wedding. The preacher speaks to a bride and groom and to those gathered.
God is not interested in you,
declares the preacher. Here Morrison suggests that life in the diaspora, can't be put right. The imagination cannot suffice. Does Morrison confirm my dread? Is dread the equivalent of beauty in the diaspora?
Across a scrim reads, maps. At the same time, lights come up on a different part of the stage where the figure of Olaudah Equiano appears, speaking the words projected on the scrim, and on yet another, Equiano's past unfolds in their conjoined memories, within which what he recalls is enacted by the ensemble, lights up on the narrator as she reads his story in a book.
My imagination was all raptured as I flew to the register office, and in this respect, like the Apostle Peter, whose deliverance from prison was so sudden and extraordinary that he thought he was in a vision, I could scarcely believe I was awake. Heavens! Who could do justice to my feelings at this moment? Not conquering heroes themselves in the midst of a triumph, not the tender mother who had just regained her long-lost infant and pressed it to her heart, not the weary, hungry mariner at the sight of his desired friendly port, not the lover when he once embraced his beloved mistress as she had been ravished from his arms. All within my breast was tumult, wildness, and delirium.
The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself, 1789.
A scrim reads, arriving at desire.
It is only now I recall, when recalling is all art, that the first book I read and fell into like a fish falling into water was a book about the Haitian Revolution of 1791. I recall the title running over the top of each page, The Black Napoleon. I remember certain names.
Toussaint, Henri Christophe, Dessalines.
I cannot recall the day I decided to read the book, but it must have been the day after my uncle said,
"Don't touch
not
that."
to touch it. Then it became as irresistible as the other contents of the drawer.
As the narrator continues, she appears as a young girl on another part of the space, moving from spotlight to spotlight, reading the book clandestinely and utterly enraptured.
I opened the book, at first leaving the drawer open with the book lying inside, and began to read. Then I took it to my spot behind the house, then to my spot below the bed. After slipping into this book, I understood that my uncle must have fallen into its face too, and
I don't want any more pages torn out.
The book was about the uprising led by Toussaint Louverture against the French at Saint-Domingue. In it, I met a history I was never taught. The history I had been taught began.
In 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered Santo Domingo. With his 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, he discovered the New World.
Everything was missing from the middle of that story. Empire was at the end. So I had never met Toussaint Louverture until I saw him at the bottom of the wardrobe drawer with the cakes and sugar where my grandmother had stowed it. I did not know about slavery. I had never felt pain over it. I had never been seen suffering. This book I had found inhabited me with its terror and revolution. It was the first big book I read to its end. When I was finished, I was made. I had lost innocence and acquired knowledge. I had lost the idea that desire was plain. My uncle let me keep the Black Napoleon. It became my book. Writing is an act of desire, as is reading. Why does someone enclose a set of apprehensions within a book? Why does someone else open that book, if not because of the act of wanting to be wanted, to be understood, to be seen, to be loved? Desire, too, is the discovery of beauty as miraculous. Desire in the face of ruin.
The narrator is as she was in the beginning, but on a different part of the stage. Across the stage from her, a spotlight arises on the narrator's grandfather, as he was in her memory in the beginning, this time alone.
My grandfather came from a country which was devastated by a volcano. This was the island where my grandfather collected the Carib in him. He left when he was a boy. Perhaps
the Carib
in him, after 2,000 years of knowing islands.
I felt the tremors of Montserrat and propelled me to a boating heading south a lifetime earlier. I came from people whose names I can't remember.
His forgetting was understandable. After all, when he was born, the door of no return was hardly closed. Forgetting was urgent.
The memory of her grandfather fades into the recesses of her past. The narrator steps away from her desk and computer and is now awash in an ocean of blue-black light.
To travel without a map, to travel without a way. They did long ago. That misdirection became the way. After the door of no return, a map is only a set of impossibilities, a set of changing locations. A map, then, is only a life of conversations about a forgotten list of irretrievable cells.
Light gives way to resonant blackness. End of play.
Thank you, Jay, for such a beautifully and striking adaptation. At this time, we will now open for any questions from the audience. Audience, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. And as moderator, I will share as many as time permits. While you're doing that, I would love to start off and kick off our discussion in asking you, Jay, and as well as the actors, can you share with us your relationship to the text? Like, what is the process that you went through in the adaptation? And can you tell us how the map has been an inspiration and prime for such process?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, this book came into my purview, several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little longer than that. And I knew the minute I read it that I began seeing it in space. I knew that it was a meditate, like it's an extraordinary work that stands on its own in the form that it's in. So of course I return to it, as so many of the exquisite speakers today and yesterday have been talking about, just returning to it again and again and again. It's a constant companion, really, to so many of us. And but I never lost the idea that it could live in this different dimension, and what would it be like to assign character perspective and to really see what might happen in imaginative space if we could parse it out in some ways, and if the figures and characters and locations and dispositions and geographies and so on, all of these different longitudes of time and space and memory could be parsed in an imaginative space, like in a theater space. And so I mentioned it to Christina Sharp, I don't know, several years ago. And she was immediately excited by the idea and said that she would talk with Dionne Brand about it. And time goes on, and I, would begin to parse little bits of it here and there. And when this extraordinary event came about, and Christina told me that there was going to be a celebration of this book at 20, and asked if I would at least begin the process of introducing like just a snippet of it. I couldn't say no to that. I said, this is where it begins. And so now I'm looking ahead to being able to just have, to luxuriate in some time to really unpack the book and really talk. And one of the things I'm thinking about is so many of the amazing reflections that I've seen across these last couple of days from all the participants could be inspirations for which parts of the book would actually serve to propel its trajectory forward without compromising any of the integrity as it sort of transfers into this different form. And I think a lot of those perspectives can help inform that.
Certainly. Would Amber or Evan, would you like to share kind of what your relationship to the text has been and maybe how it transformed or changed through rehearsal?
Well, for me, like this book really came at a very interesting time in my life right now. I think the older I get, the more I think back on just my history and my family's history. And there's so much I just don't know. And every time I go home and I talk to my family, I hear these like little stories, and like there's so much history behind the story. And it's opened this curiosity in me of wanting to go further and further. And I was like, wow, like when this book came around, I was like, well, I think that's a sign. So yeah, I'm more interested to see like where not only just I come from, but like where my family has been.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's I've been having this conversation in less poetic terms with myself and whoever is around me when I'm emotional at that point a lot recently, just about I even recently did the whole, I did I've been doing a lot of tracing and trying to figure out like, where, and the sense that some of the information I thought it would be some sort of catharsis, and it hasn't been, or, and still feeling this sense of emptiness and loss. And what does that really mean? And what is my legacy? And what is the legacy that I inherit? That's been a conversation I've been having a lot recently. And of course, Jaye is always, a great inspiration, so of course, like as that was percolating in my head, in my mind, I knew it, that she was like, hey, Amber, so I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
So I almost feel like it was a conversation I was having with myself. And then Jaye was like, let's further this conversation. Yeah, it's a conversation I've been having for a long time. And I'm really grateful that I've been able to continue this with collaborators.
I think one of the things you mentioned, Amber, that's very related to the last few lines of the reading that we have, where it says, a map then is only a life of conversations about forgotten lists of irretrievable selves, right? It's quite salient. And I think that I would love for any of you to talk about kind of how this life of conversations going into the dramatic form, what you think it can do for either the people enacting it or the audience members that could come and witness this production? It's a big question.
Yeah. I was like, oi, where do I go? Where do I begin on that one?
I think one of the extraordinary things about the book and the potential that it has is that it right out of the gate, and we can again see by the conversations people have been having at this conference, the way in which it troubles all of these traditional Aristotelian notions of catharsis, and hearkening back to what Amber was just saying. I mean, I think that having this opportunity to take a space where we can simply tarry in exactly what, and move from thought to thought, and space to space, and time to time, or time to timelessness, in order to contemplate the profundity of, as so many panelists have been talking about, return, and the devastating and also extraordinary implications of return and no return, and belonging, being and longing, all of those different ways to unpack. So I think a theater space, a communal space in which the senses are piqued in these very particular ways, as I was saying earlier, is just an opportunity I look forward to so very much.
And I think even with what's going on today and a lot of the conversations on, we see going around the country, it's that like, there's a lot of the past that just simply doesn't want to be discussed. And I think to Amber's point, like, I think when we discover some of these stories or forgotten, trails, it can be painful. Like, discovery isn't always going to be the feel goods. But I think with that, it will allow, and this is just my belief, I believe it'll allow us to be more honest in the future.
Yeah, and I think too, particularly, I think every medium has its own strengths and the things that it carries. And I think particularly in theater, when you have like living, breathing people, and you have the flesh, and you have those bodies right there, there's a difference between, we can process like a concept, we can process, even in poetry, you can process something a certain way, but then there's a difference between processing, intellectualizing, and then feeling, and just sitting in that feeling. And I think a lot of what this all is, the whole book is about just sitting in that feeling, right? And I think, I think there's something extra about, just human bodies sitting and feeling that in front of you that you can't help but just have a reaction to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm looking at a couple of the questions that are in the queue. I'm not sure, Danielle, how you wanted to do it, but I was, my eyes landed on a question about this, that refers to Barbara Christian's A Race for Theory. And, building on what Amber and Evan were just saying, this thing about, the thing that's so extraordinary here is the ability to meld feeling and thought, so that we're not necessarily leading with feeling, but we are sitting with it, and can also theorize it, and theorize the gaps and fissures that have rendered feeling and theory apart, or we might say rent theory and feeling apart from one another, so that there's become this notion that in the theater we only feel. And I think theorizing the depth and immeasurability of how much feeling the Atlantic Ocean holds in it is, and how much feeling the many holds, the back and forth, the holds of ships hold in them, is something worthy and beyond of theorizing as well as feeling.
Thank you. And even we can move to the second question that was also in the chat about cartography, which is very much related to what you are already speaking on, Jay. in how for you all that translates or has to do with composition in theater, so blocking, but also building ensemble. I know this was your initial kind of staged reading, but if you could speak on the feeling, really, the embodiment aspects of not only performing this, but potentially how that could relate to the building of the ensemble, maybe even now or in the future.
Yeah, I mean, cartography and ensemble building, wow, that's huge. And so much of the theater industry disrupts and ruptures any, because everything is so ad hoc and job, going from job to job, which is what happens to a lot of actors. So the luxury of building ensemble and mapping the longitudes of a work this epic would be something that it would be such a gift to do. And I think when actors have an opportunity to really chart the cartography of the space that they're in, and to really have a sense of their hands on the levers and dials of the architecture of a piece like this, which defies any kind of set parameters of space, because in so many ways it exceeds and surpasses. That's part of its meditation, is that it exceeds and surpasses the limits on space, and at the same time is completely rooted in a theorizing of captivity and inestimable loss and all of that, everything that came spilling out of the door and birthed the sort of nightmares that came after, but also the wonders that came after. So yeah, that would be a preliminary response to that excellent question.
And I think we even begin to see the beginnings of that in the staged reading with the reverberations of the ensemble, and how there's this spilling out aspect that is very evident. And I think then that leads to our kind of final question for our session. How might we see, as we're talking about this map being a life of conversations about a forgotten list, how might we see theater, and particularly this adaptation, serving as some kind of map, and what direction do we think we might be going in as a result with it?
I'm so mindful, and Amber and Evan, if you all have any like thoughts on this, please feel free to jump in. But I feel like again, the theater industry forecloses the breadth of process. It's always tends to be so product oriented and short-term time, like these ad hoc short-term times to get together. So the spirit that informs this, because the book itself, going through the process of rereading the book, going from one cover to the next, I at once dread the end of the book when I get to the end again, but the gift that it gives me back on those last pages where it talks about traveling without a map, without a way, embraces me in the fact that there is no end to this, because it brings me right back round. And so what I long for in developing a much fuller development of an adaptation, a real adaptation that this book deserves, and it would be to be able to relish a process of developing ensemble and thinking about what the ensemble brings to, I think the ensemble has already begun. All of these panelists that I've been listening to who've been blowing my mind for the last couple of days, that's where it begins. Those meditations in a lot of ways have already started. And as I was saying before, the thing about being inspired by making notes of the sections that panelists focused on in their talks and their framings, shaping, or even when they read works that were inspired by the book, luxuriating in a process of development is just what I long for more than anything else at this point. Moving away from product, which is not what this is about, to a real full-fledged process. Yeah.
Thank you. Any final thoughts, Evan or Amber, as we conclude?
I mean, I would say, just to sort of reiterate from what I was saying earlier, of like, one thing that really stuck out to me, now that I'm thinking about it again, is in the text you hear the echoes of the ensemble for certain words, and it's my belief that in particularly our country, a lot of Black people have echoes in the back of our mind, wondering where that voice is coming from, and where is it trying to lead us, or where is it trying to pull us back to for some, form of discovery. And I agree with Amber. I believe theater has a way of actually letting us feel that, and not, romanticize it, for too long. You actually have to, go through the fire. So I would love to see this on stage.
Yeah, me too.
But yeah.
Me too.
Agreed. And I'll throw out too that I totally hear what Jaye said. I think particularly for this work, like the process of wanting to feel like you would really need to take care of each other to get the work to really go in and do this work, you know what I mean? As opposed to like, okay, we're gonna do this, it's gonna be up, and then, they sell the tickets and this and this and that. It's like to really delve in and explore what this asks of you. You need to develop that trust as an ensemble, that would be imperative. And I think Jay could do it.
Yes.
Thank you, Amber.
Absolutely. We look forward to it, Jay. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Danielle, and Amber, and Evan, and everyone for being here. And again, the supreme honor of being part of this.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you. And this concludes our session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.